My name is Aditya, and in this video we will be walking through provisioning an Apigee installation. So to get started, we want to make sure that we have the provisioning instructions open on one side of the screen so that we can always refer to whatever we need to look at while the provisioning is happening. Now, in the provisioning, the first thing we want to do is decide whether we want to, what type of provisioning we want to do. Today we'll be provisioning a pay-as-you-go subscription, and you can see some of the details of what entitlements and differences exist between the various types. The next step is to check the prerequisites. The most important prerequisites are to have a Google Cloud project that has been newly created and to make sure that you have all the permissions required. I am the owner of this project that I created, and hence it is completely within my control. You just want to make sure that if you don't have the owner level permissions, you want to make sure that you have all these roles and permissions attached. If you just use these roles, then you don't need to manually assign permissions, but make sure that the user has these permissions before you begin. The next step would be to navigate into paid orgs and before you begin, and to provision a paid org. So in order to get started, you can reach the Apigee provisioning wizard in two ways. You could potentially click on Apigee in the Google Cloud Console, click on Setup Apigee, and the project will be auto selected for you. Alternatively, you can go directly to the setup page from the link in the documentation. We will start by clicking on Use Pay-as-you-go. The first step is to enable APIs, and that would be covered in this part of the documentation. We'll simply click on Enable APIs. That was simple. And the next step is to create an organization. As you can see, we have a few decisions to make over here. So if I click on Enable Organization, you have to choose which region you're hosting the analytics. Typically, you want the analytics to be hosted in the same region that you're running Apigee within. And you also want to choose a cloud KMS location, and I'm going to choose a regional location for this setup. As you can see in this part of the documentation here, Apigee cannot offer a SLA higher than 3 nines for regional keys. If you instead want a higher SLA, you want to go for a multi-regional or a dual regional key instead. I will simply create a key. I will choose create a key ring. Choose the location and click continue. The key name will be Apigee key name. I can choose a higher level of protection with a hardware security module in case I have a regulatory requirement for that. But for now, I'm going to go with software protection level. Click create, and a key has been created for me. I want to make sure to click on this grant button so that the right key usage permissions are granted to Apigee, and I click on create organization. This can take some time, so I will return to the video after this has been completed. Okay, that step took about 20 minutes to complete, and I just got back. Now, one important thing to mention is when you're waiting for some of these steps to complete, try to have the developer tools open in your browser so that if there is an error, you will see a non-200 status code in this section. So you open developer tools, Chrome. Let me actually show you how it goes. You open Chrome, more tools, developer tools, and it dropped me straight in network. It might drop you an element. So go to network and fetch/XHR. This will record all the activity of the XHR requests that are being sent to the backend. This is what is covered in the troubleshooting the Apigee installation part of the documentation as well. You can see that in the same part under next steps, you would see troubleshooting. Okay, now that that's completed, let's move on. So the next step is to configure service networking. There's a few cautions and notes here, which I'll cover super quickly. So this network service step is super important. You cannot go back and change the configuration. So it's important to get right during the provisioning itself. The next thing is that you need to decide which VPC to use, right? So Apigee actually uses VPC peering by default in order to tether the network of the VPC subnet that's actually running in your Google project with which is the customer VPC that's running in the Apigee VPC, Apigee managed VPC, right? So this requires VPC peering, and hence it's important to get the details correct here. You want a VPC that's not the default ideally, and you want it to be friendly for that peering connection and conformant with other requirements in your organization. The next caution is that you don't use the default. You can actually use a production grade VPC. Some best practices are covered in the virtual private cloud documentation. However, for now, you can complete the process using the default VPC, and you can later reconfigure the peering connection to point to your production VPC instead. So in this step, we're going to let Apigee do auto allocation instead of selecting manually. So I'm going to select the default VPC. Looks like I do not have any VPCs in my particular project. So let me go and create one. There are no VPCs. I'm going to click create VPC, Apigee VPC. I'm going to leave most of the defaults on. I'm just going to choose automatic subnet creation, and I think I'm going to leave the firewall rules alone. I will not be setting up any firewall rules unnecessarily, and I'm going to use regional routing and leave the maximum transmission unit to the default and hit create. This is going to take a few minutes. So I will come back to the video in some time. That took about 5 minutes to complete, with subnets setting up all over the world. I'm going to come back to this page and hit refresh, and now I have that new VPC available. And here I'm going to automatically allocate the IP range that will be required for the VPC peering with prefix lengths of /22 and /28. I'm going to click allocate and connect. This will again take some time. That took about 5-6 minutes to complete, and Apigee has set up the networking. Now we should understand actually what happened there, and for that it's useful to go look at this section of the documentation. So Apigee Get Started, Apigee Architecture Overview, and here we actually show the components, many of the components that are actually created during this setup process, right? And we are setting up this pay-as-you-go instance to actually accept traffic from the open internet, and hence we would actually be using this architecture. Now there are a few main sections here. So there is actually the customer Google project, which would be the project you're using to set up Apigee, right? The Apigee demo 002 in this case. And then there is a Apigee X runtime Google project. So this is run and managed by Google in Google's VPC. And there is a internal load balancer, layer 4 load balancer with a private IP that's in front of the Apigee runtime essentially. And you need some way to direct traffic that comes in from your API consumers, which is initially received by the external load balancer. You need a way to send that traffic over into the Apigee managed runtime, and for that reason we actually set up a VPC peering between the VPC that's in your project and the Google project, and that's what we just did, right? The other components such as the network bridge and load balancers, we will actually be doing them soon in the upcoming steps. Okay, the next job is to create a runtime. I wanted to explain what a runtime instance is, and again point you to some documentation that goes into a great deal of depth about it. So you would go to Apigee Docs Guides, Environments and Organizations, and Working with Environments. Also understanding organizations. So there's a handy diagram over here. So at the top level, you have what's called an Apigee organization. That's ultimately what we are provisioning today as we're going through the setup process. Once you do that, you create an environment group automatically, the default environment group, in which there is one environment. And because this is the pay-as-you-go, you're also provisioning two Apigee nodes for this particular environment. All that is done automatically with some configuration in step 5. Now, an environment group serves as the host name essentially that directs traffic. So your API proxies, every API proxy needs to be deployed on an environment in order to accept any traffic. And that environment needs to be in an environment group in order to understand which host name to respond to, such as dev.yourapi.com or prod.yourapi.com or simply yourapi.com as an example. yourapi.com/API proxy path will help Apigee decide which API proxy to route the request to depending on the host name. But the environment itself needs some compute to run on, and so it needs to be attached to what's called an instance, and that runtime instance is what we're actually configuring in this step. So a couple of notes here. As I said, to learn more about underlying architecture and why we're doing all this, take a look at this architectural overview, which is the same thing that I had just shown. And during the provisioning wizard, you'll be only creating one runtime instance. In the future, if you want new runtime instances, you can actually create them from within Apigee, and that will be required if you expand Apigee to other regions. Every time you expand Apigee to a new region, you need to create a new instance in that region essentially. So with that introduction out of the way, let's see what steps we need to follow here. I click on edit. I need to decide which region to run my runtime in. I'll choose the same one as we chose for the analytics region. I'm going to choose automatic IP range allocation, and I will need a disk encryption key. So I'm going to choose the key that we created earlier. Now this instance will take some time to deploy and come up. So I'll come back to the video in some time. Okay, so that took about 30 minutes and I'm back now. So in those 30 minutes, basically you would be seeing the loading spinner, and if you want an idea of what's actually happening, just keep the network tools open like I showed earlier, and you can see that periodically a request is being issued to organization name, operations, and operation ID, and this returns metadata.state, which is in progress. So as long as it's in progress, the UI will just keep retrying, and at some point when the progress actually completes, it says done is true, and as soon as that request is received, the organization details are brought in and the UI is ready for the next step. So in this next step, we'll be creating an environment, and here there is some description of what environments are, and as you can see, you can actually have many environments that in this setup, as an example, the team had created a dev, test, and prod environment each for the various services that they're building: payment, catalog, and maybe there's a monolith somewhere that potentially maps to the default environment group. So um, you can actually do your environment planning as per your needs, but when you get started, you'll just have a default environment that you can use. And as you can see in this diagram, the default dev, payment dev, and catalog dev are all dev environment. So they fall under the development environment group, which answers to the api-dev.acme.org hostname. Similarly for the test environment group and for the prod environment group. So that's one example. And here also we will be setting up Apigee nodes. This is quite important for pay-as-you-go. You need a minimum of 2 nodes for each environment that you deploy, and the maximum nodes essentially controls to what extent Apigee auto scales up in case of a traffic spike. In our case, we will be not setting any number of maximum nodes, so that we follow the recommendation here, which basically states that a maximum of 1,000 nodes can come up during a scaling event, and in that case your API traffic will not fail. But if you do set a maximum nodes and the traffic spikes, API traffic might fail if there are not enough Apigee nodes to basically handle that traffic. So I'm going to click on edit. We walked through this diagram just now. I'm going to leave the environment group name as dev, and this name is permanent, and that's fine because I do need a dev environment group, and I want a host name, and I am going to give it the host name of api-dev.acme.org, and then I will click create and attach. Now I will actually be doing additional configuration later, so this is just for a default. For 10 minutes, and now I will be going through access routing setup, which is our last step in this provisioning wizard. So in this step, we want to choose whether we're providing internet access or not, and we're going to pick internet access, in which case a load balancer will be created with an external IP. This domain obviously will not work, which is fine for now. We can configure it. We choose the same VPC for the managed instance group. So if you remember, we needed some network bridge virtual machines that will send traffic from the load balancer to the instance group to the runtime, and we need to choose a subnet for that, and we will actually just choose the same subnet that we used earlier. And here the VM instances will use that subnet, and Apigee will enable private Google access for that subnet. The certificates I am going to skip, which can take some time to actually provision. or rather what I mean by that is I am not going to create my own SSL certificate. I'm going to let Google provision a certificate, a Google managed certificate, and that can take some time to deploy and attach to the load balancer. So I'm going to click set access. And this will take some time and I will be back. That took about 30 minutes and now I'm going to hit continue. At this point we have a record and we have the IP address. So this is fairly important information. Now we look at deploy sample proxy. So here we just want to deploy a sample proxy that we can then hit. So I'm going to click on deploy API. And wait for the deployment to complete. Now, meanwhile, what I need is to do some DNS settings. So in order to keep things simple, I'm going to use a free service called nip.io and I'm going to make a few changes to enable that. So I'm going to open the Apigee console. And I'm going to switch to this pay-as-you-go environment that I had just deployed, which is Apigee demo 002. I had another environment which was an eval environment that was running, but then I switched to the environment that I just installed. So here I go to admin, environments and groups, and I'm going to edit this group name, and here I will add the actual domain name that I wish to use with my Apigee installation, and for this it would be go.apigeedemo.dev. That there are a couple of steps that I need to take. First, I need to make sure that this domain name is pointing to the correct IP address, and that IP address would be the load balancer essentially. So we first go to the load balancing section of the right project. This is the project in which we've deployed the Apigee environment. We go into the load balancer and we take note of the IP address. That IP address needs to be added as an A record. So in my cloud domains, which is under a separate project, I navigate to the cloud DNS section for that particular domain. I go into the zone and I make sure that I've added an A record that points to the correct IP address, which is this load balancer. After that, I need to edit and make sure that my HTTPS certificate is correct. Earlier I had the Apigee SSL cert, which was pointing to the acme.dev, but then I clicked on create a new certificate. I gave it the name Apigee SSL cert go, and I said create a Google managed certificate, and I put down go.apigeedemo.dev as the domain here. Now it's important to have your A record set up before you click create here, because the Google certificate service actually verifies whether the IP address is correct before it provisions a certificate. Now I've done that part and I've hit create, and that certificate is now in the process of provisioning. And with that, I click on cancel, and I'm essentially waiting at this point. So I click on the certificate. The status is in provisioning. So the certificate needs to finish provisioning, and then it needs to attach itself to the load balancer, and this can take some time. I'll come back to the video in some time. I'm back. So the certificate has finished provisioning by now. So if I go to the cert, I can see that it's active, which is good. However, if I try to actually send a request to the hello world proxy that was deployed, I'll still get an error. And that is because if I look at my load balancer again, the backend service is this managed instance group, and it does not have any healthy instances. So this happens when the instances didn't launch potentially. So I go in here and see what the problem is. I see that none of the instances are actually creating properly, and I can go and check the errors, and it's because my constraints of my organization have been violated. For example, secure boot, and any other constraints. So mostly it seems like secure boot is the first problem to solve. So that's the first thing I'll try to solve. So I will navigate to IAM. And I can navigate to organization policies. And here I look for require shielded VM. So I can resolve this in a few ways, and for the sake of this demo, I will essentially customize and turn off enforcement across the board and hit save. And now that that's been fixed, I can go back into these instances and try to restart or replace the virtual machines, maximum unavailable instance, or click on replace, willing to boost up to as many machines as required, and I click on replace VMs. I can see that the instances have been replaced, and I got some new instances open here, and I can come to the load balancer and check, and I can see that when I reload, I have all the healthy instances I now require. And then I come back and reload this, and now I'm getting a response from the proxy. So this is the end-to-end setup for pay-as-you-go. You may not encounter some of these errors, but we decided to include them in this demo anyway, so that if you need to debug them, you'll know how to go about it. Thank you for watching.